So what I'm going to talk a little bit about really is the concerns around registration of our pesticides, because I think a lot of us think things are operating a certain way, and I've come to learn from information that I found that's not really what I thought. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit, and then I'm going to let these guys kind of tell you things that we can do instead of using pesticides, as we are in a lot of farms today. So in order to understand the concerns, you kind of really need to understand a problem. So I'm going to just do some real general terminology, because some people are unfamiliar with the terminology, even though they might think they are, that pesticides are actually an ecocide, and it's any substance used to kill or repel an animal or a plant. So that includes herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, etc. So actually a herbicide is a pesticide, so sometimes people get mixed up and they think a pesticide is just to kill rodents or insects, but that's really not the case. And if you don't believe me, you can look it up in a dictionary, because some people get so confused when they're reading terminology that they think that doesn't make sense, but it's really the way it is. And this is a picture of a young guy actually down the highway spraying. There's mostly grasses in this area, but they were using pesticides, or herbicide really, to kill vegetation along the highway when you could use mowing. You can see sometimes people mowing, and in this area he was just using a lot of herbicide, and it didn't look like it had very good protection, so I didn't get out of my car to ask him exactly what he was spraying, but it's kind of concerning. So I just want to talk really briefly about the regulatory bodies with pesticide regulation. We start with the federal government. They actually take the studies that industry provides to register products, and they also reevaluate pesticides every 15 years. They're supposed to. They also enforce compliance with regulators or applicators to make sure they're following laws as they're supposed to. And the province also does that as well. They also do some other things like transportation, and they can, within each province, we can have different regulations. Like Ontario has about 295 products that they've banned, and Quebec has also got some stricter regulations. Alberta really hasn't got anything different than what Health Canada has implied. But we have some municipalities that have taken upon themselves to put further restrictions on pesticides, so that's happened across Canada. I'm not really going to talk about that too much today. So I like to show this letter just so people really understand that Health Canada doesn't actually have any laboratories of its own. It's industry that provides the science to Health Canada. So I actually asked the question, you can see at the bottom here, that it's actually industry that provides the science. So I think that's important to know, that we don't have a third-party independent science. It's provided by industry, and that's important, I think. There's a lot of registration concerns today. And well, they've probably always been there, but maybe more evident now. There's a doctor in Ontario who's really researched a lot of this. So first of all, I mentioned industry provides the studies. And then animal testing. We have to do animal testing, of course. We can't do it on people. So we do it mostly on rats. And rats have enzymes in their bodies that can process poisons that we don't have in our bodies. So that's something to know. So the other thing that's a concern is we don't do long-term studies. It's quite expensive to do like a 2-year study. So we don't actually know the low-dose exposure on pesticides. We only know really acute exposures. So that's also a concern, because most of us are actually exposed to low-dose exposure in our food and in our environment. There's no testing done to address endocrine disruption, and that's very important, because endocrine systems are what really dictate all the organs, how they're going to operate in our body, and this also has deals with issues around cancer. And we only test the active ingredient. This is really quite a big important one, because with formulations, like if you think of Tylenol as a product or Roundup as a product, there's additives put in there. That's never tested. They never test formulations. They only test the active ingredient. And with lawn chemicals, there can be 3 different herbicides. So that's another thing that's not tested. They don't test combinations. They only test each active ingredient independently. And so if you're exposed to several pesticides at the same time, think of like drug interactions. A doctor will be concerned about drug interactions. Well, we don't know what those are. They're not tested. And it's also assumed that the formula that whoever is applying the product is looking at the label. And if you ever see people applying pesticides in their yard, you'll often see that they're not wearing gloves, they're not using protection. And as you saw the picture of that young man, I wonder how he felt at the end of the summer because he really had no way to prevent inhaling that pesticide that he was spraying. So medical literature is also something that hasn't historically been used. When we're talking about that, we're talking about like epidemiology, which is the study of populations being exposed to something and what that shows in literature. So that's not really used. We're not using medical evaluations of exposures. So also reevaluations are not being done. We have 7,000 pesticides on the market today. We use a chemical in Edmonton that no one else in Canada or probably North America uses for mosquitoes. And the Attorney General of Canada actually mentioned in the audit recently that this should have been reevaluated in 1984. And it started to be initiated in 2000, but it has not been completed. So this is a concern because this is a very harmful product. We're talking about chlorpyrifos. And we don't really work independently. We work with the US Environmental Protection Agency. So we kind of depend a lot on that collaboration to make decisions, and it would be better, I think, if we're working independently, but we're really not working independently. There's a lot of pressures on Health Canada to get products out on the market. So, and some of the pressures that I mentioned, doing these evaluations, you can imagine 350 scientists evaluating and registering. There's over 1,000 products that are up for registration right now. That's a lot, because you got studies to look at effectiveness and health issues and so on. So it's quite a lot. And recently, like last year, about a year ago, the Attorney General of Canada did an audit. If you want me to send that to you, I'll give you a card and I can email the audit to you. It's readily available. It's quite disturbing because in this audit, and it was in the media, but if you didn't read it, you would have missed it, 80 pesticides with conditional registrations. That means, and in the words in this audit, that they have not had the required science submitted before registration. So you can imagine if you were taking a drug that did not have the science submitted on it, you'd be pretty upset. Well, this is in our food system, and it's used quite, some of these pesticides are used quite broadly in our food system. So there's a lot of concerns around that. And right now, 80 pesticides. And also, really, it's old school to say the dose makes the poison. There are a lot of products that even a low dose is very harmful. I mean, we know this now with children who are exposed to alcohol, when they're a fetus. Lead is another example, and there are pesticides that are just as harmful in very low dosages. So the dose makes the poison is not correct, really, for a lot of cases. And when you learn a little bit about toxicology, I've sat in some toxicology classes, it's quite interesting to see how that works too. It's not exactly what we think. So I just put a little bit of the headline of that story up. Also, we don't have water standards in Canada. This was something, as a person working in healthcare, I was quite shocked to learn. I thought we had water standards. We have water guidelines. That's completely different. That doesn't have any legal implications if there's a contaminant in a water attached to it. And what is even more shocking is that 21 contaminants don't even meet, with the guidelines that we have, do not even meet what the World Health Organization recommends. Some are 3 to 10 times higher for our pesticides. So if the water is tested, and in some municipalities, they don't test all the contaminants that can be in their water. And this was CBC did a story on this, that Winnipeg doesn't test a lot of the contaminants in their water, and there's places up north that don't. So these people are vulnerable, and without water standards in Canada, and I think everybody wants to know that their water is safe to drink, what happens if there's a water contaminant in there that could be harmful? It doesn't have to, we hope that the municipality takes upon themselves to do something, but if there's a pesticide in there, what are they going to do? Are they going to tell people not to drink the water? I know that we've had pesticides in our water here in Edmonton. And also, when are they tested? So in Edmonton, we test for pesticides. We do test them in the summer too, but not when there's a runoff into the water. We test it in February. which is not useful. We do test it in the summer, but we test it 4 times. February is not going to tell us anything about pesticides. So and some people, I ask them the question, you take a look and find out, and they're quite shocked to find out what it actually works. So I'm not going to talk about this too long because there's so many things to go over, but everybody should kind of have an idea what the symptoms of pesticide exposure are, because they really mimic a lot of other health issues. Like you could think you could be on a golf course and maybe they just sprayed, and maybe you got a headache and you think you've had too much sun, or you have a little nausea. So you're not going to necessarily know that you've been exposed, but you could have these symptoms. So that's something to note. With some of the really harmful pesticides, like chlorpyrifos, where some women have horrible, their children had horrible birth defects because they had known exposures in the home when they used to have household products, had things like headaches and stuff like that. So, you're not going to make that connection until later on when you know that you've been exposed, and then something happens later on, a lot more serious. So this was on a BC agricultural website. I think this is really useful to show how vulnerable we are. We think our skin is a barrier, but a lot of people get medications now with creams, So our head area, in their words, I don't know if I have that on the whole thing, I'm trying to blow it up, but the head area absorbs pesticides faster than if you ingest it. So think of kids close to the ground, rolling around on the grass. They're certainly more susceptible to taking more of that in just because of their proximity to the ground. And it makes me think about what I'm putting on my skin as a woman, if I'm using cosmetics, so it's another thing to think about, ladies. But the skin, oral, and respiratory tract can all take pesticides in. And of course, we ingest that in our food too. So there's multiple ways to have this coming into your body. So I want to talk a little bit about Roundup because it is the most widely used herbicide in the world. And the active ingredient is glyphosate, and there are additives in there, surfactants, that helps the pesticide adhere to the plant surface, and that makes it, and studies we found recently, more toxic, which kind of makes sense, actually, when you think about it. If something's going to adhere to the plant, make it more, there's other things in there as well, but that's one of the things that I'm pointing out in this case. And there's 3 things to know about glyphosate, which to me was really interesting is working in microbiology, is I didn't believe this when I heard it, and so if you have any questions about anything I'm telling you, I will give you the information so you have it. Glyphosate's patent is that it's licensed as an antibiotic. So, oh my God. Yeah. So this is in our food system. We've tripled the use of this, according to pesticide sales in Alberta in 15 years. So that's a huge thing. It's also been classified by the World Health Organization as a probable carcinogen, and some of the scientists say that they feel it could even be called a carcinogen, that will change probably from the science that's been coming out, because there's lots of studies on that. We also have this in our waterways. I have water surface studies done 12 years ago. 65% of our surface water has some kind of pesticide in it, and we've certainly increased a lot of them since then. And it's linked to a lot of diseases: cancer, infertility, recently liver disease, and I looked it up to see there's a 30% increase of liver disease in Canada in the last 8 years, and specifically we're seeing a lot of that in Alberta. 20 million Canadians now are diagnosed with gastrointestinal illnesses, and that's including, everything. So IBS, Crohn's, celiac, you name it, all of those diseases are included, and that's from 10 million in 10 years. We've increased. I'm saying to myself, I'm thinking it's probably what we're eating, and it's of course not going to just be the pesticides probably, but considering how much we've increased our pesticides, and in the audit they say all pesticides have been increased, quite a lot. So I think that's probably has something to do with it. Pesticides also affect the soil. They affect the soil organisms. They contaminate the water. They destroy beneficial species and impact climate change. And we're certainly having a lot more weed resistance in the U.S. It's quite a serious problem, and it's certainly a problem in Ontario. We're starting to see that here too. So I don't know. I'm going to try to quickly go over NeoNEX here because they're quite important. 36 of these are mentioned in the audit, is having the unconditional registrations that we're talking about. And 50 scientists from around the world went through 800 peer-reviewed studies and said that this is 5,000 to 10,000 times more toxic than DDT. And it gets into our water, It's affecting all insects, not just bees. I'm told that our bee populations are not affected in Alberta, but I'm not sure that our surveys are really reflecting that. And I'm hearing from other beekeepers that are not included in these surveys that they have big concerns. So I'm not sure we're really getting valid information about what's actually happening to our bee populations. And of course, this is affecting several species of birds. And I heard a professor from the Saskatchewan talk about toxicology. And industry takes the most resistant organism to test the toxicology. But when you look at all the other organisms in our waterways that are much more sensitive, this is a big deal, because when we wipe out all our insects, this is a huge thing. And then there's alternatives. And we're going to talk about that today. And I think we're going to hear some of that. So there's been lawsuits around this. A little bit about like organic. There's some long-term studies showing how you can reduce the effects of carbon, the impacts of carbon, creating a carbon sink, let's put it that way, and also having a better system in your soil to absorb water when there's too much water and to retain water when you're in drought conditions. So all of these things are going to be more and more important with climate change. And so that's just sort of a recap of some of the concerns. And if you have any questions about anything that I've said and you want to see the evidence of what I've said, please come and see me. I do talks for free to people because I feel this is so important, because I think it's affecting every aspect of our food system and our health. There's lots of things we can do. I like this game. I don't know if you played Jenga before, but I keep thinking we're taking out little pieces of things in our ecosystem, and eventually things could just fall apart, and we could have widespread famine. I mean, it's possible. It's happened before. If we keep removing all these beneficial insects, what's going to happen? So that's my concern. Lots of things we can do. I have petitions here. I have buttons. I have signs if you want them for your lawn. I will do talks for you, and I will focus it to any group. So if you have grade 4 kids that want to think about what a dandelion or even a mosquito is good for, I talk about the ecosystems of these things and how they interact and what their importance is. And as much as we hate mosquitoes actually filter our water, just as a little trivia piece for you.